Welcome everyone to today's lecture on datafication and accountability. My name is Maximilian Heimstädt and I'm a senior researcher at the Department of Sociology at Bielefeld University. I am also head of the research group Reorganizing Knowledge Practices at the Weizenbaum Institute for the Networked Society in Berlin. I would argue that accountability is one of the core concepts through which scholars and practitioners make sense of datafication. In the context of datafication, accountability is oftentimes discussed together with the notion of transparency, which you can learn about or have already learned about in another lecture of this series. The concept of accountability itself is not new. In the context of organizations, we usually associate accountability with liability and control. Being accountable then means something like being obliged to report to someone else about decisions made and actions taken. The common sense idea of accountability also includes that the account giver might be punished in case of misconduct. While accountability is not a new concept, it has gained tremendous prominence in times of datafication. It is oftentimes portrayed as a magic fix for the uncertainties that arise from datafication. The purpose of this lecture is to shake up this assumption a bit and to provide you with a set of tools for critically examining the relationship between transparency and accountability yourself. So, let's start to complicate things a bit by diving into a short case study on Google. At its annual developer conference in May 2017, Google CEO Sundar Pichai announced the firm's move from a mobile-first towards an AI-first strategy. While this strategic shift might have come as a surprise to some people in the audience, it was in fact foreshadowed by Google's growing interest in the transparency and accountability of AI technology. Only a few months prior to the developer conference, Google co-founded and broadly promoted the non-profit organization Partnership on AI. This organization conducts and makes openly available research on the ethics of AI and develops best practices for the technology industry at large. Through this move, Google presented itself as a firm which strategically embraces a new and powerful technology, artificial intelligence, but at the same time ensures greatest accountability through unprecedented transparency around this technology. This story could have easily ended here, as one in which Google managed the uncertainty and risk of AI through transparency and accountability. However, it did not. Despite this explicit commitment to transparency and accountability around their new strategic focus, public criticism regarding Google's AI efforts have burgeoned ever since. For example, critics argued that Google would outsource moral responsibility when developing AI for military use, or that it made ethical mistakes when demonstrating the language proficiency of its AI assistant, and that it raised concerns about the ethics of data harvesting when revealing details about advancements in facial recognition AI. So, this is all somewhat perplexing. On the one hand, powerful firms like Google embrace transparency and accountability as their core values and standard business practices. New digital tools and technologies allow these organizations to share unprecedented amounts of data and code with their stakeholders. On the other hand, citizens, activists, and policymakers use digital platforms to organize large-scale and enduring protests against these corporations, accusing them of opacity, unethical business practices, and a lack of accountability. In other words, the more organizations embrace and stakeholders demand transparency and accountability, the more difficult it becomes to understand how these concepts relate to each other. What I offer you in this lecture are 3 perspectives on the relation between transparency and accountability. You can use these perspectives as tools for your own research projects. Depending on your research interests, some perspective might be more helpful than another. Playing around with these perspectives can help you tease out the most interesting aspects of the phenomenon you're interested in. The first perspective is called the causal perspective. This perspective is very close to the common sense understanding of accountability and transparency. When you decide to adopt a causal perspective, you subscribe to the idea that accountability is something inherently good, something that makes organizations contribute to the well-being of their stakeholders and society at large. This perspective sees transparency as an important precondition for accountability. In other words, the perspective assumes a direct relationship between transparency and accountability. The more transparency there is, the more effectively organizations or other entities can be held to account. There is another important feature of this perspective. The causal perspective treats the concepts of transparency and accountability as resources used by researcher analysts. This means that this perspective is not so much interested in what people in organizations regard as transparent or accountable. To make this perspective work, researchers or researcher analysts have to come up with their own definitions of transparency and accountability and apply these definitions to their empirical data. To make this less abstract, let's look at an example. What you see here is the Open Data Barometer. Until 2016, the Open Data Barometer was published by the non-profit organization World Wide Web Foundation. The aim of this project was to develop a global measure of how governments are publishing and using open data for accountability, innovation, and social impact. This research project is a good example for the causal perspective on transparency and accountability. It comes up with its own definition of transparency, namely the number of datasets that are openly published on the internet. Hence the name Open Data Barometer. We do not learn how exactly the study defines accountability, but we get the impression that this does not matter too much due to the causal relationship with transparency. The more transparent countries are the ones with better accountability in place. A statement that is expressed through the color-coded map that you see here on the slide. The causal perspective is a powerful tool for policymaking, as its practical implications are so clear. If you want better accountability, more transparency can get you there. The second perspective that we learn about today is the critical perspective. The main assumption of this perspective is that there is indeed a relationship between transparency and accountability, but that it is not direct but complex. On the one hand, the goal of this perspective is to show what kind of accountability is created by different forms of transparency. On the other hand, this perspective can also reveal which new forms of opacity and closure emerge at the same time and alongside accountability and transparency. The critical perspective is different from the causal perspective in many ways. However, it has also something important in common. The critical perspective treats transparency and accountability as analytic resources used by researcher analysts as well. In other words, to show that a certain form of transparency creates limited accountability, researchers need to define for themselves what unlimited or complete accountability would look like. Let's take a look at another example that helps us illustrate this perspective. Some of you might remember, in the early 2010s, there was this new political party around in Germany and some other parts of the world that focused on questions of datafication, the Pirate Party. One of the core promises of the Pirate Party was to create unprecedented levels of accountability through new digital forms of transparency. In 2012, members of the Pirate Party were elected to the parliament of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. Immediately, they began to install webcams to live stream their meetings. They also made all of their official documents available online. However, very quickly they discovered that this radical form of transparency puts them in a position of strategic disadvantage against the other parties in the parliament, who did not share their internal documents. As a result, the Pirate Party politicians developed a new set of tactics and norms. For example, a mutual understanding which sensitive topics would not be discussed in front of the webcams, but in smaller, face-to-face interactions, for example, in the hallway. The example of the Pirate Party shows that greater transparency does in fact create new forms of accountability, but that the specific form of transparency, live streams of the meetings, also creates new spaces of opacity and situations that are not accounted for. The third and final perspective deviates from the first two. I call this the constructive perspective. The goal of this perspective is a symmetry between researchers and practitioners. Symmetry here means that we do not grant the right to analyze to researchers only, but acknowledge that practitioners, for example, those people who work at Google or for the Pirate Party, analyze and make sense of the world as well. This commitment to symmetry has an important implication for studying transparency and accountability. In this perspective, we as researchers do not define what transparency and accountability means to us, but we study how practitioners use these concepts to interpret and make sense of their datafied world. Instead of identifying relations between transparency and accountability that exist out there in the world, our role, that of the researcher analysts, is to study how practitioners relate these concepts, how they stabilize these relations, or how others contest them. Again, to make this perspective less abstract, let's consider another example. The constructive perspective can be particularly useful when studying transparency and accountability in staged performances. At the beginning of this lecture, I told you about the Google Developer Conference. At this conference, the CEO told the audience, developers and journalists, we might assume at this point, about the firm's transparency efforts and the accountability that resulted from it. A helpful research design for the constructive perspective would be to compare and contrast this stage performance with other stage performances. For example, you could look at how Google employees speak about transparency and accountability at policy conferences. At these conferences, Google employees are more likely to face an audience that contests their definitions and pushes back. So, does this different situation evoke different definitions and relations between transparency and accountability? If yes, how do they differ, and what can this difference tell us about the work that these concepts achieve in a particular situation? Okay, let's wrap it up. In this short lecture, I tried to make the point that accountability is a core concept for understanding organizing in times of datafication. I further argued that accountability appears alongside transparency, and that thinking about the different ways in which these concepts relate can be an interesting research strategy. Eventually, we learned about three perspectives: causal, critical, and constructive, that can guide your own research projects on transparency and accountability. If this is something that sparked your interest, you can learn more about the three perspectives in a paper that I co-authored with my colleague Leonard Dobusch from the University of Innsbruck. You'll find a link to the open access paper in the online materials of this course. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of this seminar.